So this is not an air versus coil video. We're just going to compare both shocks. So essentially, there's 5 days of sunshine in January, which is unheard of in the Pacific Northwest. So we're going to go back to back on both the DHX2 and the Fox Float X2, see which one is best. Now after riding every single shock in the entire market, damper, Fox X2 family is definitely the best of Main Street, not Wall Street and not alternative. Both of these shocks were under $500 at jensenusa.com. So if you go here and you click sale, your shock size, you can get some serious deals linked in the description. So there's some serious problems with these two shocks, and we're gonna go fix them right now. After some glamorous unboxing, we have the notorious Fox Float X2. So when you open up this one, you better save this because you're gonna have to get it sent in to get warranted. The Fox Float X2 is currently recalled. Open a warranty ticket and send it back to Fox. Oh wait, that's 2016. We're on to 2021 to 2023. We have a silent recall going down, but don't worry, I do have the DIY fix. There's no arguing that this shock is truly impressive as far as appearance. The reason these shocks were more than 50% off, I'll show you right here. So I did highlight this right here. It's 230 by 57.5 on the DHX2. At 57.5 is a very rare size. Only a couple bikes I know of with it, like a Trek. So the 57.5 number has to do with the stroke amount right here. So fortunately, on the coil shock, it's super easy to change the stroke. And these are the travel reducers, the stroke reducers. Once all the stroke reducers are taken out of this shock, it's officially a 230 by 65 stroke, which means it's worth more money if I go to resell it. What makes the X2 family so special is it has high speed compression up here, what I'm adjusting, 10 clicks, and then we have 8 clicks of high speed rebound. There is no other shock on the market that has high speed rebound. So I've been having a rash of bad shocks lately, so it's really important whenever you get new suspension or used suspension to do some thorough checks. So here's step number 1. You're going to depress the shock and it should return to its home position. So straight out of the box, I got to fix this shock. This is a fairly common issue, maybe not with brand new shocks, but it's a simple fix on the DHX2. Remove this dust cover on the piggyback. And then we get this special adapter in our shock pump. We're going to put it back up to 100 PSI. So if you do own this shock or any other shock on the market, you should be able to compress it on the table and it should return to its resting position. Getting that mechanic drama out of the way, we have a full functioning DHX2. So I'm a little bit curious, because last winter or last summer I rode one of these. It was like completely clapped out and I actually had to rebuild it. So I'm gonna find out if there's like a break-in period and if it feels better new versus clapped out and rebuilt. So I have 2 springs here. Also gonna answer another question, underspring or overspring. So every damper, basically I rode every damper on the market, and typically you get a little bit extra performance from a coil shock by under or over springing it just a little bit. If you have a very dull rock shock coil, it doesn't matter what you do to it. This is a really high performance, well damped shock. So I have 2 Cane Creek springs, 550 and 600. There's a really nice feature on the DHX2. We have detents, so when you wind the spring down, it's going to stay in place. I'm using a Cane Creek spring, and Cane Creek does sell adapters. Without the adapters, it's a little bit wiggly, but it seems okay to me. An amazing feature of Fox shocks, they are very narrow, so essentially you can use any spring on the market. This is the second shock in a row with 20 to 30 PSI low inside of the piggyback, so it is very important to do the check. Depress your shock and see if the IFP charge has basically leaked out. There's always going to be a specification for the internal floating piston gas charge. We got artificial intelligence. The X2 is 100 psi. Oh. The 21 to 23 X2 in my hand right here is absolutely a piece of junk. So I can't even ride it one single time. But the goal of the 5 days is to do a lot of riding. So let's jump back into the DHX2. The X2 family can be incredibly difficult on the setup department. Fortunately, I made this video here, how to set up the DHX2. So I went back and I rewatched the video and it looked like I had all the adjusters in the middle to get some mediocre level performance, and some super advanced performance was full fast rebound, but more on that later. When considering a coil shock, especially the DHX2, you better know the leverage curve of your bicycle. So essentially the higher the number, the more it is harder to press down into the travel. So you need to have at least 30% progressive frame to make the DHX2 work. If you do have a Rocky Mountain, go check out my video, because that's the only source for the leverage curves on that bicycle. The DHX2 has the perfect matching plushness of the Fox 38. I'm running a 180mm Grip X damper 38, and I've forgotten how well these two match up. There's no arguing that coil shocks are more difficult to set up than air shocks, so I have this reverse components super nerd bike tool, which will help me monitor how much travel I'm using. After a 3-foot hook to flat, I am clearly clean into the bump stop, so we will get into the biggest problem on the DHX2. First run in on the DHX2, this is a truly impressive shock. It does not feel like a sluggish old coil, and that is because basically the setup I have on this shock is everything in the middle. But remember, it's all relative to how much spring force you have. The hardest thing about a coil is essentially finding the right spring. By running a softer spring, typically you can get a faster rebound. But the DHX2 is a special shock. It is very linear, meaning easy to press down into the travel, so I'm able to run a heavier spring and get away with a faster rebound. Remember, everything in suspension is a compromise. While this thing is incredibly soft and allowing for those fast rebounds, it does like to wallow deep into its travel. It is so nice to be back on a coil. But there's one problem. This thing is using an incredible amount of travel. This is starting to make sense why you see so many pro athletes riding the air shock. So let's try to fix it and see if I can start using less travel and make this more effective on the bigger hits. 5. So maxed out high-speed compression. The over-analytical engineers will basically say that this is high-speed movement and complicate it. If you just look at it like bottom-out control, it usually does the job. While climbing up to the next section of trail, I turned the motor off on my e-bike to see what the penalty was for having a coil shock. So for whatever reason it is, that coil spring definitely saps quite a bit of your energy, and I was reaching for that climb switch within about 25 seconds. With the high-speed compression in the full locked out position, 10 clicks, going through some faster compressions, essentially there's no changes to the shock, it's still wallowing deep through its travel. But I did make one mistake. I didn't go through the same section as before. While the DHX2 is a good shock, it is still somewhat of a kid's toy when you stack it up on that section of trail against EXT and Öhlins. Getting back to the first section of trail, I was having problems on the DHX2. During the deep compressions, when you're getting a hard bottom out, the bike becomes a little bit unstable through this section when it's basically riding on the bump stop. So this is my current setup. Middle rebounds, middle low speed compression, but I maxed out the high speed compression and there was no change. The high speed compression adjust on the DHX2 is pretty ineffective. Everything in suspension is kind of like cousins. So this is the main piston on the DHX2 and the Fox Float X2. When you move the high-speed rebound adjuster, you are changing the main shim stacks. So they call it high-speed rebound, but let's give it a shot and slow the high-speed rebound down and see if it stops wallowing. The most effective, fastest way to set your suspension up is 3 settings: on, off, and middle. So I move the high-speed rebound to the full slow setting, and let's see if it stops wallowing. Full slow. By moving the high-speed rebound to the fully slow setting, the bike stopped wallowing deep into its travel and was substantially more in control on high-speed impacts. So remember, sometimes when you think it's a compression problem, it might be your rebound. The mission is to see which shock is better, X2 or DHX2. If you ever hear this sound coming out of your X2, it's officially called the slurp. Many people have struggled with this shock for years. Bike shops, myself. Basically, you go get it rebuilt, spend $200 and it blows up the same day. This is straight out of the box. So essentially 21 to 23 is an absolutely defective design. Unusable, pretty much junk. You have to send it into Fox. They're like silently recalling it. If you live in Europe or South America and you have no Fox dealer where you can send it into in a reasonable distance, let me show you how to fix it. I'm going to jump inside of here and attempt a DIY fix on here, cover some tuning options, travel changes, and a few key areas. So what Fox is doing with the Fox Float X2 is essentially a very common corporate practice. They would rather pay the lawsuits and the people who complain about their bad shock than issue the recall, because the recall would cost them substantially more money than a few lawsuits. Ford did this with the Ford Pinto. Basically, if you got rear-ended in a Pinto, you died and you blew up in a fireball. And Ford was like, we'll just pay those lawsuits. So Fox is like, oh, we'll take a note from that. I do have an entire video on how to rebuild the Fox Float X2 at home, but I will cover this key area. So the shock is particularly dangerous when it is slurping because we have super pressurized oil inside of it. If you wanted to do this, make it less dangerous, you remove the Schrader valve out of the piggyback, and then you're going to slowly crack the bleeder open. Because I never rode this shock, it's not going to be super charged oil inside of it, but if you were riding it, you'd want to put it in a bag at this time. So check out the cavitated oil. Another note is, this is a 2022 Fox Float X2 and it had about 150 PSI in it when I pulled it out of the box. So it just sitting in the box caused the oil to cavitate. So the longer these sit, the sooner they're going to pressurize. So if it was freshly manufactured, it won't cavitate as fast. As I have dozens of videos on the X2 on my channel that didn't cavitate right away. So it's just basically a time bomb. To accomplish the travel change or the stroke change on the Fox Float X2, it is a very involved process with shaft clamping and a whole bunch of specialty tools. So it's not like the coil shock where you can just unbolt it with a 2mm. This is a pretty challenging process. Here is the stroke reducers buried underneath the air cans. 7.5mm travel reducers in this shock made it a 230 by 57.5, so it'll officially be a 230 by 65 by removing these. I initially thought the high-speed rebound was a little bit gimmicky because I couldn't feel it, but realizing this actually shifts the main piston shim stacks, it's a very powerful tool, and hopefully the last segment in this video helped you use it better. Here is the 2024 Fox Float X2 seal head. I will link this part number in the description. So I looked far and wide for this seal head. So Fox won't even sell you the repair parts for their defective design. You have to search the internet deeply or watch my video. I found this at S4 Suspension in Canada. In the technical Fox instructions, they call this the bearing, but essentially everyone in the industry calls this the seal head. It's the main sealing surface that keeps the high pressure air in the air shock out of the oil. The black one is the original one with one single O-ring. which is not nearly enough sealing power to keep out 300 psi if you weigh 200 pounds. When you compress the shock, the air pressure goes up to 600 and the air goes inside of the oil and makes a slurpy noise. The DHX2, the coil shock here, it has a completely different seal head, but you have to remember the coil shock is only dealing with atmospheric pressure, not pressurized air like an air shock. And ironically, the DHX2 has a oversized O-ring sealing out atmospheric pressure, so that's why the DHX2 doesn't have such a problem. The DHX2 is not perfect, and neither is any shock on the market. One problem area to look out for in your DHX2 is this tiny O-ring I just set on the table. It's the bleed screw O-ring. It likes to tear, so I'm suspecting the bleed screw comes loose. That was what was wrong with the shock that I had to rebuild. The notorious Float X2 has two different sets of volume tokens. I'm holding on to the negative token here. The negative token will absolutely kill the small bump sensitivity, so I always remove them because I like the plushest ride. The benefits of the negative token installed, this one was installed from the factory. It is going to ride better on aggressive terrain and require you to put less main air pressure in the shock, effectively making the shock more reliable. Removing the negative tokens does require you to remove the air cans and all the shaft clamping, but you can cut the negative token out or you can weasel it around the seal head. The proper way to do it is to remove the actual seal head like I'm doing now. While completing the full damper service on the defective 21 to 23 X2 to install the new seal head, I did note that this one was incredibly harder to bleed than the 2024, so I'm suspecting the 2024 X2 has some different valving or oil ports inside of it. So this is what will happen. They'll start off squelching first thing in the morning after they sit with the pressure in there, and then it'll go away and it will ride fine and do that for a few weeks. And then it will go into a full-time squelcher. So we have the updated seal head, and let's go try it. Starting out on the newly rebuilt Float X2, I looked down and realized I forgot to plug the bike in. But this is a good thing because I got to climb in eco for both shocks. The Float X2 climbing experience, it's pretty good because it is not a soggy DHX2 wallowing into its travel, and I didn't have any pedal strikes on the way up. The golden ticket to not get confused in those adjusters is to put them all into the middle after finding your spring rate. My Float X2 is running 270 psi, which comes out to 30% sag. Before starting the race, I needed to check the Float X2 setup was at least adequate. I wasn't going to go flying over the handlebars. So how does a 230x65 Float X2 ride with the negative token removed and one token installed on a progressive bike? Right away, it is a very good experience. It reminds me of the 205/60 trunnion mount I had on my Specialized Enduro. For whatever reason, the 205/60 trunnion mount does not have a negative token installed, and it is a substantially better experience, even on the 230x65. So if you want traction and a softer feeling shock, remove this negative token. This trail is called Little Moab, and it's not in Utah, and it's a very chunky trail. Unfortunately, the wind is like 40 miles an hour, so I'm a little bit nervous. So I downloaded Strava. I'm going to see which shock is faster, the X2 or the DHX2. Not a huge fan of racing, but we'll call this the gate right here. No goofing off. Got to go as fast as possible. Keep in mind, I'm not the best rider in the world. I would rate myself as a C+ rider, but it was also like 40-mile-an-hour wind, so I had to kind of stop throughout my race run. Once the wind calmed down to about 30 miles an hour, I got back on the bike. The Fox Float X2 is definitely not the most inspiring shock I've been down this trail on, but I had to think about this, and I'm on the Rocky Mountain altitude. which is a long travel bike, but it's no Specialized Kenevo with a dual crown fork. So remember, the capabilities of the bike are going to dictate how confident you are on the chunky terrain. So we're looking for segments. After popping Strava open, I had literally 0 segments. And I'm like, what the hell's going on? There has to be a segment on that trail. It's a super famous trail in the Pacific Northwest. Then I had to remember, my ADD brain couldn't stay on the trail because it's just funner to ride the little side paths. Okay, make sure you edit this part out. If you're currently suffering from a pedal strike problem, like on the Rocky Mountain with its 170mm cranks, the DHX2 will turn this problem into an absolute nightmare or a broken toe. On the positive note with the DHX2, I do have some back problems, and while doing the 800-foot climb to the top of the trail on the DHX2 at this rocky slab called Syncline, the DHX2 is going to give you substantially more comfort. And if you're on an e-bike, who cares about the efficiency factor? Let me know if this is different for you, but when I ride new parts or new bikes, basically I'll test it, and if I get a good response, I'll push it a little bit more and continue on until I find a point that I don't feel safe. When going down this trail in the DHX2, I instantly had substantially more confidence, wasn't dabbing my foot, and not walking nearly as many sections. Now, the most important thing during this race run I discovered on the DHX2, I put both race runs into the editing software and put them 2,000 times faster than I ride because you don't want to watch me bumble down the trail. On the Fox DHX2, I had a 17-second time and I felt very not confident the entire way down. When it came to the DHX2, I felt 20 to 30% more confident, and the times show, with a 4-second faster time at 13 seconds. This is only technical terrain, but DHX2 will definitely make you feel more confident and safer, and the little caveat of being more comfortable on the climb. Now, your trails may not be like savage chunky rocks like this, so air shocks may be better for you. Now, I know a lot of people like this shock, so let's jump into that, and then afterward, I think I have the solution for her. The last and final day with the Float X2. Is it more poppy than the DHX2? First of all, it is definitely more supportive during the first big impact. The Float X2 is kind of floating over the terrain, so at this point I am going to say the Float X2 is definitely more poppy. I'm going to say 10 to 15%, but remember all the compromises from the chunky trails earlier. The first flat landing on the Fox Float X2, the rear wheel was a little bit skippy. This should be an easy fix, some slower rebound and some firmer compression. Going back off that jump, it was definitely better, but this is my favorite thing to do with the Fox Float X2. Instead of constantly pulling the 3mm Allen key out, you have this very handy switch here. It is the firm mode, it is 100% not a climb switch. I personally love the Fox Float X2 with that guy on. So I'm going to hit that same jump with the lever on and see how she feels. After hitting the firm mode on that lever, this Fox Float X2 with the negative token removed was absolutely dialed. Very impressive on those pounding blue flow trails. So after pounding this for 2 days straight, there's no squelching noise, but we're going to check what the pressure is. So it started out with like 270 PSI to get 30% sag. I weigh 100 kilograms, 220 pounds. So I'm on the like upper echelon of air shocks, in my opinion. You can't overpressure them, but you're basically just riding in a compromised state. 256. The theory is pretty much proven. You can do it above 250, but the top performance is 250 and lower. It's at 256. The shock is really impressive once you take that negative token out of it. So the real test is, how is that DHX2 going to be with a 600 to 750 pound progressive spring? Because the only thing it's lacking is support on the big hits. The plan was to swap out 550 to 600 pound regular springs, but the DHX2 is so linear, I'm going to try this progressive MRP spring with a massive rating of 600 to 750. When running these progressive springs, you need to make sure the tightly wound coils are on the bottom because they will creak less if you put them like this. I'm speculating that a lot of Fox athletes are choosing to ride the Fox Float X2 because the DHX2 is so lackluster in the deep stroke department. In the off-the-shelf version, of course. They could probably get them custom tuned or whatever. I've been playing around with the progression on this DHX2 all week. 37%, 45%, did almost nothing. Maxing out the high-speed compression did nothing for the deep stroke wallow. Slowing the high-speed rebound definitely helped, but I was still pedal striking on the last climbs. The magic number for progression is about 35%, or just go buy the Cascade Component Levo long link kit. That thing is the best thing I ever rode. But the Rocky Mountain does have this 37%, and with the progressive spring, it may be fixed. The only way I could determine the penalty for riding the DHX2 versus the Float X2 was to go ride them back to back within the same 2 hours. I'm going to say the DHX2 does have a penalty of about 10% in the poppy playful department. But remember, substantially more comfortable and lots of pedal strikes. The problem area from before is like a 5 or 6 foot jump, but it does have a flat landing that really stresses the shock and the bike. The DHX2 kind of fell apart here, and it was just all over the place because it was getting a hard bottom out. With the 750 pound progressive spring on there, we went from a hard bottom out to a soft bottom out. During a soft bottom out condition, you stay in control of the bike. The shock is substantially more composed during the heavy bottom out conditions. You just need to do like 5 to 6 foot jumps, have a 30% progressive frame, run a progressive spring, maxed out high speed compression, and be a C+ rider. So you know the pro guys probably have a custom tuned DHX2 on their bike, and I'm wondering if that would really help me a heavier compression tune. But this does explain why the DHX2 is the most famous shock on the internet to break. The fact that Fox sells this shock off the shelf in such a linear compression valving tune without a progressive spring option offered directly from them is almost as bad as the Fox Float X2 scandal. This DHX2 has no business on any type of linear bike. So if I was a Fox athlete and I was stuck with Fox springs, I would probably go for this because it's so supportive. The real winner of this video is EXT and Öhlins, but you gotta click this video on your screen because we'll see how that DHX2 stacks up against those.